Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and it's time for another prepper chat. And I thought I would chat with you guys a little bit about some points when comparing the 40 S&W with the 10 millimeter. These are both calibers I now load. I have been doing 10 millimeter, and then obviously compared to things like 9 millimeter. Because we start talking about prepping, and people always bring up that 9 millimeter, in their opinions, is a better prepper cartridge than the 40 S&W. A lot of it has to do with supply, but realistically, guys, supply isn't really all it comes down to. Because at the end of the day, if you're talking about a very serious long-term raw scenario, there's going to be extra handguns laying around anyway. So look, you need to be worried about what's going to give you the most effect for everything that you want, which you can stockpile. There's a lot of other factors that you have to factor in. But as far as your sidearms go, there's going to be extras around eventually. And so whatever ammo you can get is different. What you're talking about is what you can have initially with your own stuff. We're not talking about resupply later. Because trust me, if you can find 500 rounds of 9mm laying around, you're probably going to find a 9 millimeter. They're everywhere. It's not like it'll be hard for you to find a 9 millimeter if there's a major event and there's a population situation where a lot of the population dies. In the worst case raw scenarios. So again, having more firepower has its advantages. And here's what I will agree with. If you're just using regular ammo that you're buying yourself and you're stockpiling, I understand the 9 millimeter. It makes sense. I get it. But if you're a hand loader, because I'm loading 40 S&W right here, people don't understand that 40 S&W hand loads, even with FMJs, have dramatically more potential than the 9 millimeter. They're not in the same ballpark. What you need to understand is that production 40 S&W is neutered. I know a lot of people say, oh no, it's really hot ammo. No, it's not. They use too fast gunpowders. They use way too fast gunpowders, and quite frankly, off the shelf, the most powerful 40 S&W you find from normal commercial companies, excluding Buffalo Bore and Double Tap, which seem to want to charge an arm and a leg for bullets that didn't cost them that much to make. Excluding those companies, nothing is even within 100 feet per second of what you can load yourself while being at safe pressures using listed data from companies like Hodgdon, who, is one of the biggest gunpowder manufacturers in the entire world. Load data that they publish for the 40 S&W dramatically exceeds anything you can buy off the shelf, even the hottest stuff you can buy from everyone from Federal to Spear to Remington, any of these people. And this can include even your FMJs. And that's something you've got to consider. None of that stuff off the shelf even gets within 100 feet per second. Not even within 100. So they're not even within 10% of what you can make yourself without even going to a max load. So we're talking about staying 1,000 PSI or lower under the SAMI spec for the 40. And the reason for that is the fact that it has the same cartridge pressure as a 9 millimeter till you go to plus P. It has a larger cartridge. It's longer cartridge, right? That longer cartridge gives you more potential case volume when you start compressing powders or running really slow powders. The problem is that they use too fast of powders, right? Because they're just trying to make efficient use of the burn. It's just normally a larger diameter cartridge can make better use of a faster powder usually, right? But they also give more complete burn and allow for slower powders in some cases, as long as you don't mind the pressure going up a bit. But what you need to remember is that when you start pushing these, even using heavy for caliber bullets, we're not talking about the light stuff, because usually you can fudge the energy numbers. You can fudge the energy numbers on pistol cartridges by running lighter bullets really hot, right? You can boost it because, again, velocity is squared in the kinetic energy equation. But when I'm talking when you're running heavy bullets, like 180s, you can easily hit 500 plus foot-pounds without even going to a max charge. In other words, you don't actually have to hit the top end of the published load data with the best powders and stuff like long shot to reach that. Things like Blue Dot do really well, because I'm a big fan of Blue Dot. I like it, even though it meters like crap. It's a fun powder to shoot. I load it in a lot of stuff. I used to load a lot of 357. I load it in 10 millimeter. I even load it in 9mm, right? It actually is pretty good too. You can get right around with it while staying at really low pressures with a compressed load, you can hit stuff that's just as good as the hottest self-defense ammo. Right there at whatever bullets you want. With that, but long shot can go, up to another 150 feet per second faster. And what I mean by that, when you look at 10 millimeter, you have to hand load for 10 millimeter to exceed what 40 S&W hand loads do. In other words, if you can easily take a 180 grain like this, using long shot with a max charge with a book load, go up like 1150 feet per second. All right, go back and think about that compared to something like your 9 millimeter, your heavy 147 grains. It's very rare to see them break 1,000. You got to load hot to get to 1,000. You start talking 1150, that's what 124s and stuff do. Right, you're down in the 124 range for the 9 mil, but you're sitting there with a 180 grain 40 caliber bullet. That's while staying within factory pressure. That's not a plus P load. That is actually a load that is 1,000 psi under the SAMI spec, but it's the highest book load that they'll list for it, because there's obviously energy to consider and everything else too. There's more than just pressure. There's energy and kickback on the gun and everything. So ultimately, what you find, start looking at the best law enforcement 10 millimeter ammo. It's all neutered. It's just hot 40 S&W. That's all it is. But go look at the gel test, like the 140, the 175 Winchester silver tips that were developed for the FBI. You can still buy those, by the way. They only move about 1,100, maybe a hair more. With a 175, you can push this 180 to 1150 with hand loads with a 40 S&W. Same thing. I mean, I like to use these 1 to 180 grain XTPs. All right, what about the 180 XTP Hornady, like critical, whatever they call it, whatever critical duty or whatever, I don't know what they're calling the 10 mil. Basically, it is their law enforcement load for the 10 mil. It moves about 1150. In other words, it's moving the same velocity for their 10 millimeter law enforcement load. That same bullet in a hand load for the 40 using long shot can also go 1150. You can hit the exact same velocity out of a normal Glock 22 like this, right? What about if you go to a Glock 35, a longer barrel, or if you put a longer barrel in one of these, then you're going to push it even faster. You can do that out of a 4-inch barrel, guys. 4-inch barrel. All right, you're up here into the actual production ammo for 10 millimeter. So in other words, unless you're hand loading your 10 millimeter, of course I've got a longer barrel here, your 10 millimeter isn't any more powerful than the best hand loads out of this. And you can do that with the FMJs too. A lot of times people say, well, a lot of, the hollow points, they tend to be shorter, right? So you can end up running them out longer with the same grain weight, so you get lower pressure and you can get a hotter load. Well, all your 40 S&W FMJs have a flat B plate, right? They're flat point. Believe it or not, this isn't terrible as a survival cartridge. When you load them up hot, I mean, you start pushing 1100 plus with 180 grain. Even your FMJs with that flat point, a lot of hunters prefer that in handgun loads because it seems to do a little more tissue trauma damage. It's not a lot more. It tends to punch through bone better and cause a lot better bone fragmentation when it goes through without losing your penetration. So a lot of hunters have noticed that and believed that over the years. It's never always been confirmed with ballistic testing, but hunters have noticed it and claimed it over the years. So again, there's something to that. Well, a 180 grain 40 caliber moving 1100, 1150 with over 500 foot-pounds of energy, that's a decent survival cartridge, and it's still 40 caliber. But what are you getting in terms of barrier defeating capability? Did anyone really think your 9mm is going to compete with that for barriers? Better sectional density, velocity in many cases, depending on what you're using. And then that's still that flat point. And it's that flat point that lets you do that. And a lot of 9mm won't cycle flat point. It lets you run the bullet out longer with any given grain weight so that you can load hotter. Gives you more wiggle room on the pressure while staying in the safe range. So you can load a lot of these 40s really hot, partially even due to the bullet design for your FMJ bullets, and stay within book spec. And then obviously hollow points are a little different. They tend to be very similar anyways in regard to that. So what people need to remember, if you load them a little bit hot, even your cheap FMJ stuff, out of your 40s, if you're running stuff like long shot, I mean, but even other stuff, power pistol, blue dot, all those actually, you can get them pretty hot. You can't get them as hot as long shot. Long shot is a beast in 40. Absolute beast when you look at the charts. Nothing else competes with it. And it's also one of the slowest powders in that range. And it's because people load too fast of powders for the 40. And no one makes book data for the other slower powders. I'd be willing to bet, just because of the flat point on these, that they're probably, if people experimented more, and I wish there would be more book data, there might even be stuff that competes with long shot. It might even exceed it, stuff in that same burn rate category. And the thing is, because you can run it out longer and it's got a pretty good size case capacity, you can get away with a lot of compressed loads. Like, I think the blue dot, the only reason you probably can't go hotter with blue dot than what you can is because you get to a maximum compressed load. And I've loaded a bunch of these with blue dot and I've put them at that compressed load. They don't show any signs of being at pressure. Not at all. And it's just because you compress so much powder because it's fluffy. But I think some of the other slower powders that you can get away with compressing, I mean, there's probably a lot to be said. Maybe eventually people will make better book data, but I can't see a lot. But it doesn't matter because long shot is cheap and long shot is available, and this gets the job done. And this is competitive. You're basically turning your Glock 22 into a 10 millimeter, but a non-hand loaded 10 millimeter. But by that same token, you're going to want case support anyways in an aftermarket barrel if you're loading them hot for the 10 mil. So, again, you're still having a bigger investment to get there. But it's just interesting. And people sell that short, and they're not thinking about that in those terms as a prepper, that, well, when you start hand loading, the 40 really wakes up. And even these FMJs, now you wouldn't obviously want to use those in civilian or even law enforcement defensive situations, because you're going to have a serious over-penetration issue. All right, you start looking at even the 10 millimeter 180 grain FMJs moving at those sort of velocities. When they gel test them, they end up going through 32 inches of gel and just come out the back. So yeah, you've got a lot of penetration, but you start thinking in terms of barrier defeating capability, you're pretty good there with a handgun, and that's with again, same size handgun your 9 mils are. Glock 22 or Glock 23 is not that big. So the 40 S&W is no slouch for the prepper once you start hand loading, and that's what people need to remember here. I would say if you're not going to hand load, I get 9 millimeter. I get it. If you're just going to be buying whatever FMJ stuff you can get off the shelf, which your budget allows, and you're not going to hand load, which again, I got to question why you're caring about budget if you're not hand loading. Begs the question. I get it. I understand why people would pick 9 millimeter, but if you're going to be hand loading and you're wanting some guns in that size and capacity category, the 40 S&W does make a lot of sense for the prepper, because people will argue all they want about cavitation versus capacity and rate of fire. Okay, that's fine. Let's say they're relatively equal, and I think we agree they are. You really look at the FBI data, they kind of agree. Yes, the 40 makes a slightly superior wound, but you get a slightly slower rate of fire and slightly lower capacity. That basically balances out in a firefight, more or less. They're roughly equal because of that. So they would say there's no advantage gain there for regular use, but what about barrier defeating capability? You don't think in a raw scenario having barrier defeating capability, if you have to fall back to your sidearm, you don't think that matters? Or if you have to go in somewhere with a sidearm and it's the only weapon because you need to conceal? In those sort of scenarios, in a raw, I think that barrier defeating capability matters at that point. You're not really losing anything for it. You're really not, other than a gun that wears out a little faster, because that's the real downside. That's the reason the FBI is going away from the 40. The snappiness, right? The snappiness and the wear and tear on the gun. So the pencil pushers are aware of that. They're not really getting superior stopping ability, right? Because shot placement, capacity, everything else. They're not getting superior stopping capability on soft targets. But it does wear the guns out faster. And some of the smaller agents, the recoil is an issue, and that will reduce their combat readiness, right? If you're less accurate because of the recoil being really an issue for you, it isn't as good of a firearm for you. But again, most of you out there, if you're a serious prepper, you probably are in somewhat good shape. You probably lift. You're probably not a weak person. You probably practice. I don't think that's as big of an issue. And I would be looking at seriously the ability to have barrier defeating capability, the ability to have even a hunting cartridge if you have to. I mean, worst case scenario, you could do worse than a 180 grain flat point or hard cast lead 40 caliber moving 1150. I think you could do worse for taking down medium sized game or even big game if you got in close enough. All right. So when you're looking at an overall survival cartridge, it makes sense. Now we could argue and compare it with the 45, which I've already stated I think is a fantastic survival and prepper cartridge. We could argue all day long about comparing the two. Me personally, I have both now, so I don't have to pick between the two, do I? I guess I'll only have to pick in a raw scenario which one I'm going to take right now. And there are pros and cons to each. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.